Welcome to the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare Learning Module on the topic of Understanding Secondary Traumatic Stress in Child Welfare. After completing this learning module, you will be able to define secondary traumatic stress, or STS, in relation to child welfare work, understand the prevalence of STS among child welfare workers, understand the impact of STS on child welfare services, understand individual and organizational risk factors that may lead to STS, and you will learn strategies for reducing STS. This learning module is structured into 9 parts, which are listed here. One child welfare professional described her experience of secondary traumatic stress in this way. You don't realize it because you're just doing your job, but trauma becomes imprinted on you. Child welfare workers who are affected by secondary traumatic stress offer poignant descriptions of both the pain and the impact of working with trauma on their lives. Throughout this training, we have included several quotes that describe some experiences of child welfare workers and help to illustrate the many different ways that secondary traumatic stress can affect people's lives. In Part 1, we will talk about what is secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress, or STS, is characterized by symptoms of intrusion, avoidance, and arousal, resulting from empathic engagement with traumatized clients, as well as exposure to traumatic stories and events. STS is an occupational hazard for social service providers. Many of the symptoms of STS are normal reactions that most professionals exposed to trauma will experience at some time in their careers. However, for some people, if it is left unaddressed, the experience of STS may affect the physical and mental health of the practitioner, and in turn, it will also affect the delivery of services in child welfare agencies. Part 2. Why is this topic important? Child welfare professionals are at a higher risk than other helping professionals for developing STS symptoms. It is because of their daily contact with physical, sexual, and emotionally abused children and traumatic material, as well as exposure to deaths and threats of violence and assaults against the child protection workers. A study by Cornell and Myers found that 72% of child welfare workers had worked with a child who had witnessed an actual death. In addition, 99% of those respondents had the experience of working with a child who had been sexually abused. A second reason why it is important to address secondary traumatic stress for child welfare professionals is that burnout and secondary traumatic stress have been cited in numerous studies as reasons for the disproportionately high turnover in the child welfare profession. One study found that by the second year of employment, nearly 40% of workers with an MSW had left their job in child welfare. Later in this presentation, we will talk more specifically about the negative effects that STS can have on individuals and agencies. This is another clear description by a rural child welfare worker who is realizing that her life has been impacted by the work with trauma survivors and that she needs to get help. Please take a moment to read this quote. Part 3. Terminology. This section will define terms associated with stress experienced by child welfare workers that are often used interchangeably to characterize the impact of stress and trauma exposure on workers in the social service field. These terms include burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and secondary traumatic stress. In the child welfare system, secondary traumatic stress is the term that has been used most often. Burnout is characterized by a slow erosion of energy and motivation to do a job. It includes feelings of exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. Burnout is different than secondary traumatic stress in that it is related to work-related stressors, for example, chronic tedium, paperwork requirements, or overwhelming amounts of work, rather than exposure to trauma. Vicarious trauma has been described as the cost of caring for and caring about traumatized people. It is a negative transformation in the experience of the self as a helper that comes about as a result of empathic engagement with survivors' trauma material and a sense of responsibility or commitment to help. Perlman explains that workers are vulnerable to vicarious trauma because they are repeatedly exposed to trauma material through their empathic connection with clients. What makes an experience traumatic for the client is their experience of loss of control. And when the worker also experiences a lack of control over the situation, they may experience vicarious trauma. In other words, workers can experience themselves as not helpful when they are impacted by the trauma that they are working with. Compassion fatigue refers to a physical, emotional, and spiritual fatigue or exhaustion that takes over a person and causes decline in his or her ability to experience joy or to feel and care for others. Compassion fatigue can affect people in any kind of situation or setting when they are expending energy to care for others. This could include people who are not in a therapeutic or social service role, but are in more of a listening role, for example, teachers or doctors or nurses, or anyone else who has been overwhelmed by responding to traumatic situations. Some scholars, including Bride and Figley, view compassion fatigue as a term that is synonymous with secondary traumatic stress and distinct from the concept of burnout. Other scholars, like Stam, believe that compassion fatigue is larger than STS and encompasses things such as paperwork or too many cases, things that one typically associates with burnout. Lastly, secondary traumatic stress is characterized by observable reactions to traumatic exposure that may mimic the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Figley defines secondary traumatic stress in this way. It is a syndrome of symptoms nearly identical to PTSD, except that exposure to a traumatizing event experienced by one person becomes a traumatizing event for the second person. In other words, professionals who work with individuals and their trauma material may undergo the same cluster of traumatic symptoms as do the victims of the trauma itself. The next section of this module explains secondary traumatic stress symptoms in further detail. Part 4. What are the symptoms of STS? As just mentioned, symptoms of secondary traumatic stress may parallel those of PTSD, whose symptoms are divided into these three separate clusters: intrusion, avoidance, and hyperarousal. The first cluster of symptoms are related to intrusion. These symptoms could include having intrusive thoughts about a traumatic event, having disturbing dreams about the event, feeling a sense like you are reliving the client's trauma, and psychological distress or physiological reactivity in response to reminders of the traumatic events or stories. Please take a moment to read these quotes by child welfare workers who are experiencing intrusive symptoms. While it may be disturbing to read these quotes, perhaps you find that you can relate to these workers' experiences. It is important for child welfare workers to realize that STS symptoms are common and it is important to be able to recognize them. The second cluster of symptoms is related to avoidance. This could include avoiding clients, avoiding people, places, or things that remind you of the traumatic material, having an inability to recall client information, having a markedly diminished activity level, feelings of detachment from others, emotional numbing, or having a sense of a foreshortened future. Please take a moment to read these quotes from child welfare professionals who are describing the experience of detachment from others and emotional numbing. Keep in mind that while numbing and avoidance may become the tendencies of workers exposed to a lot of trauma, they actually serve to negatively reinforce the secondary traumatic stress. Rather than avoiding and numbing one's reaction to trauma, it is important for workers experiencing STS to seek consultation and support. The third symptom cluster are symptoms related to hyperarousal. These could include difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, having a constant sense of irritability, having difficulty concentrating out of a sense of being just overwhelmed, feeling constantly on guard or watchful, or being easily startled. These quotes illustrate hyperarousal symptoms and describe the way that child welfare workers exposed to a lot of trauma and experiencing STS symptoms could become suspicious of everyone around them. Lastly, people experiencing secondary traumatic stress report significant distress as well as impaired functioning in their family life, socially, and in their ability to perform their job functions. In their 2012 article, Talberg, Avinadav, and Chemtab describe some ways that unaddressed STS can affect child welfare professionals. They state that it can lead child welfare staff to feel helpless, avoidant, isolated from their colleagues and supervisors, have reduced perspective and critical thinking skills, adopt a negative worldview, and have difficulty recognizing and monitoring their emotions. They further state that being in a constant state of survival mode can also make it difficult for child welfare staff to recognize true emergencies and prioritize their world accordingly, which can impact the quality of their work and the safety of their clients. These are quotes from child welfare workers who are suffering from unaddressed STS and is causing significant distress and impairment in their functioning. This is another way of looking at the symptoms of STS and the ways that STS symptoms affect many different areas of one's life. Please take a moment to review this slide. Part 5. Prevalence of STS in Child Welfare. Again, the topic of STS in child welfare is so important because child welfare professionals face a higher risk of experiencing STS symptoms than do other helping professions. Here are some studies about the prevalence of STS in child welfare. A study by Cornell and Myers found that 37% of child welfare professionals report clinical levels of emotional distress associated with STS. Another study by Bride, Jones, and McMaster found that 34% of child welfare professionals met criteria for work-related PTSD, and 92% of those reporting experienced at least one STS symptom. In other words, research studies of STS have historically indicated that at least 1/3 of child welfare workers will meet clinical criteria for work-related PTSD, and most workers will be affected by at least one STS symptom. In Part 6, we will focus on the impact of STS on child welfare. This slide lists several ways that STS can impact child welfare professionals. Some of the ways in which secondary traumatic stress negatively impacts individual child welfare workers include short and long-term emotional and physical disorders, strains on interpersonal relationships, substance abuse, burnout, oversensitivity or decreased sensitivity to violence, a diminished self-confidence in using one's clinical skills, and decreased energy, cynicism, despair, or hopelessness. Untreated STS in child welfare workers also has negative impacts on child welfare agencies. These include high staff turnover and interruption of services to clients, the high costs associated with recruiting and training new staff because of high turnover, diminished service quality, decreased job morale and job performance, increased absenteeism of staff, and increased staff conflicts. Bride states, when child welfare workers are impacted by STS, there are also negative implications for clients, as child welfare workers experiencing STS are also believed to be at a higher risk to make poor professional judgments, such as misdiagnosis, poor treatment planning, or even abuse of clients. Tulberg and colleagues share an interesting way to think about the effects of STS on the workplace. They state, if several people in a work unit are highly short-tempered, argumentative, and pessimistic, it is bound to negatively affect the people around them, leading the entire work area or organization to function like a traumatized person. In Part 7, we will discuss the risk factors that may lead to STS. Now that we've discussed the impact of STS on the child welfare system, both on individual practitioner level and on an organizational level, we will now look at some of the factors that contribute to a high prevalence of STS in child welfare. Research indicates that some individual factors may be risk factors for the development of STS. These include cumulative life stressors, a longer length of time in the profession, having a personal history of trauma, especially if that trauma occurred during childhood, utilizing cognitive and avoidant coping strategies rather than emotion-focused strategies, and having inexperience or a lack of an educational background or training in social work. Researchers have also identified these organizational factors that may be risk factors for STS in child welfare workers. Working over 40 hours a week, administrative pressures to close protection investigations prematurely, inadequate supervision and lack of emotional support from supervisors, having large caseloads, the high turnover rate of staff, personal assaults on the job and threats of violence, low salary and limited advancement opportunities, intense media scrutiny, and the risk of lawsuits. One CPS professional stated, related to media scrutiny, "When I go somewhere and someone asks where I work, I say I work for the state. There's so much negative stuff said in the newspapers about us that I just don't want to get into it." Part 8, Prevention and Intervention Strategies for Addressing STS. Professor Brian Bride recommends the following strategies for preventing STS in child welfare: education, preparedness, and planning. Education about STS helps prepare professionals as they enter the field of child welfare and as they work in the field to be able to identify their own risk factors and ways that they might be affected by working with trauma. Preparedness is both on the part of the agency and on the part of the individual, and could involve providing information in the recruiting, hiring, and training process about the potential risks of trauma work to help create more realistic expectations, and providing accurate information about the skills and attributes necessary to work successfully in the field. Finally, planning on the individual worker level could include developing self-care plans and support systems early on, while the agency can ensure supportive services are in place on an ongoing basis to address the cumulative effects of chronic trauma exposure. Child welfare professionals should take an active approach to addressing the effects of trauma exposure to ensure that they are taking care of themselves. As Figley points out, ultimately it is up to each caregiver to take proper measures to protect themselves and their colleagues. Experts in the field recommend personal strategies for self-care, which are sometimes referred to as the ABCs of self-care, and include awareness, balance, and connection. As part of increasing awareness, workers can learn to recognize and identify STS symptoms and monitor changes over time. Can learn how working with trauma can affect your life, work, and perspective. And workers can learn to recognize their own triggers for experiencing STS symptoms. You are building your awareness right now by participating in this learning module about secondary traumatic stress, and it is important to continue pursuing education about secondary traumatic stress and its effects. Balance refers to creating and maintaining healthy boundaries between work and personal life, setting realistic goals, seeking out new leisure activities and maintaining a rich personal life, recognizing and avoiding negative coping skills, and in the workplace, balance could include practicing time management skills and having a balanced caseload or workload. Finally, connection means avoiding professional isolation, seeking out and listening to feedback from friends and colleagues, developing support systems and opportunities for debriefing, seeking training to learn new skills and build competence, and maintaining connection to one's spirituality. Hendricks has detailed another way of looking at these personal strategies for self-care and preventing STS. She divides them up into what she calls self-care domains. Please take a few minutes to review these strategies. As the importance of self-care cannot be understated, here is one final thought. In order for us to be there for and with these children and youth who have experienced serious trauma, we must attend to our own well-being. One way we do this is by continually assessing and addressing our own experiences of secondary traumatic stress. Later in this presentation, we will discuss 2 tools that workers can use to measure their own level of secondary traumatic stress. This slide describes some organizational strategies that can be implemented to address and prevent secondary traumatic stress in child welfare workers. These include acknowledging that STS is an occupational hazard and normalizing the effects of working with trauma material, offering peer support programs, job rotation to limit high-stress situations and facilitate new skill development, supporting self-care for supervisors and staff members, implementing interventions that increase the safety of workers, and offering continuing education that addresses the emotional impact of the work and strategies for managing stress. There is growing research on organizational interventions that are being piloted to prevent and address STS specifically in child welfare settings. We will discuss some of these interventions in the following slides. This presentation has pointed out the need for regular monitoring of STS symptoms among workers. One way that workers can do this is by utilizing the Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale. The Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale, or STSS, was developed to screen for secondary traumatic stress. This measure is available as one of the resources attached to this learning module. The STSS was designed to assess the frequency of intrusion, avoidance, and arousal symptoms associated with indirect exposure to traumatic events through clinical work with traumatized populations. Organizations could use this screening tool to track STS being experienced by their workers. Identification of high or increasing levels of STS among child welfare workers at an agency could suggest the need for an organizational intervention. A second screening tool is the Professional Quality of Life Scale, or ProQual. It consists of 30 items and 3 subscales that measure compassion satisfaction, secondary traumatic stress, and burnout. Whereas the STS is relatively simple to score, users of the Professional Quality of Life Scale are referred to the ProQual manual for help scoring the measure. The website for that is listed here. Another intervention is the Colorado Secondary Trauma Prevention Project. The purpose of this project is to provide emotional support and psychoeducation training for Colorado child protection workers and their supervisors. The goal of this project are to provide accurate and preventative training, to offer information and strategies so that child protective staff better understand how to combat negative effects of STS, and to provide a forum where staff feel safe and comfortable discussing their emotional reactions to trauma. Training and consultation in this project includes stress debriefings, individual consultation, and bi-monthly 2-hour-long trauma and stress reduction sessions, which can be both introductory and advanced. The facilitator in this project utilizes a variety of training methods, including surveys, questionnaires, and films. The Resilience Alliance is an intervention developed by ACS NYU Children's Trauma Institute in New York City to reduce STS and increase resilience of child welfare staff. The goal of the intervention is to reduce attrition and improve case practice. The intervention focuses on 3 areas: collaboration between workers, supervisors, and clients working together toward a common goal, optimism, or anticipating the best possible outcome and the ability to reframe challenging situations in positive ways, and mastery of the skills to perform one's job effectively, to regulate negative emotion, and to engage in self-care. There is a training manual and participant handbook available on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website for those who are interested in learning more about this particular intervention. While this learning module has focused primarily on the negative effects of secondary traumatic stress and its impact on individuals and organizations, it is also important to point out that when dealt with effectively, secondary traumatic stress can also promote resilience and protective factors that can reduce or at least moderate the influence of secondary stress on worker well-being. Figley calls this phenomenon secondary stress resilience and states it is associated with deliberate and strategic coping that includes self-care and the effectiveness with which workers can attract and maintain social support. In other words, although child welfare workers face STS as an occupational hazard, by deliberately and strategically identifying STS symptoms and developing self-care strategies and appropriate support systems, child welfare workers can both protect themselves from secondary traumatic stress and continue to remain effective and fulfilled by the important role that child welfare workers play in our community. Part 9, Recommendations for further research. Research shows that STS has many harmful effects for workers, organizations, and clients, and yet despite these hazards, some workers are able to successfully cope and work for many years in the field of child protection. More research is needed at this time to understand the risk and resilience factors related to the development of STS, such as how some veteran CPS workers are able to cope with job stress, strategies that mediate stress at individual and organizational levels in child welfare to promote worker retention, and more research is needed on the development and implementation of organizational strategies that are cost-effective and train CPS workers to manage STS in the workplace. The steady increase in numbers of child abuse and neglect reports today, the numerous risk factors of the job, and the high rate of turnover among child welfare workers all point to the need for a better understanding of secondary traumatic stress and effective strategies for prevention and management within the child welfare profession. There have been a number of excellent resources that have been designed to help child welfare workers manage the stress associated with working with childhood trauma. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, STS is an occupational hazard in the field of child welfare. However, there are many ways that child welfare workers can protect themselves from STS and also build resilience so that they can continue to be effective in their jobs and feel fulfilled by the important work that they do. Please pause this presentation and complete first the Child Welfare Trauma Training Toolkit Self-Care Inventory, followed by the Balance Plan. Both links appear on this slide. Completion of both of these worksheets is required in order to receive CEUs for this presentation. In May 2012, the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare hosted their 13th annual conference, which was on the topic of secondary trauma and child welfare. Please take a few moments to look at the materials from this conference by clicking on the first website. Then, as a requirement for receiving CEUs for this presentation, please take 10 to 15 minutes to review the Resilience Alliance program handout from the conference, which you can find by clicking the link on this slide or by selecting Tulberg's RAP handout from the website. Material from this handout will be included in the questions that are attached and required to this presentation. The Resilience Alliance program handout comes from the Reducing Secondary Trauma Among Child Welfare Staff, the Resilience Alliance Participant Handbook, which is a handbook full of many tools and techniques for child welfare workers to use in order to build resiliency in a challenging job. The link for this handbook is also listed on this slide. Please pause this module in order to complete these requirements. The Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare also published a companion publication on the topic of secondary traumatic stress in their spring edition of CW 360. This publication includes many articles from important scholars in the fields of both secondary traumatic stress and child welfare. These are additional resources where you can find further information about secondary traumatic stress in child welfare and also information on other topics related to working with trauma and particularly childhood trauma. You have now completed this portion of the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare learning module on the topic of understanding secondary traumatic stress in child welfare. Participants completing this learning module are encouraged to review the many resources that are attached to this learning module.